and a brain capacity that is 2.5 times larger than the normal human brain.
This is what happened when researchers finally compared ancient Peruvian skulls with modern DNA technology and uncovered evidence that challenged long-held assumptions about early populations in South America. The premise seemed simple at first. The 3,000-year-old remains from the Paracas Peninsula carried unusually long skulls that most scholars believed were shaped through deliberate binding during infancy. Yet once genetic sequencing and AI reconstruction were applied to their fragments of bone, the picture became far more complex. What emerged from the analysis suggested a lineage that did not align cleanly with established migration models for the ancient Americas. Origins in the desert. It begins in the arid landscape of southern Peru, where layers of wind-carved sand preserve traces of a culture scholars would eventually call the Paracas people. Their funerary bundles, textiles, and burial chambers had been studied for decades, but the shape of their skulls remained the most debated feature. The heads appeared unusually elongated, extending backward in a smooth arc that did not match typical human proportions. Early explanations relied on cultural practices, since head shaping existed in regions across the world, yet the Paracas examples stood apart, and researchers struggled to understand why some skulls carried features that did not easily fit the pattern of deformation alone. As technology advanced, specialists began revisiting the remains with new tools. CT scans, digital modeling, and measurements revealed that several skulls possessed cranial volumes up to 1/4 larger than average, along with differences in thickness and density. Some researchers highlighted the absence of the sagittal suture in numerous specimens, a structural line that normally separates the parietal bones in a human skull. In these cases, the dome appeared to form as a continuous plate of bone, creating a structure that was difficult to attribute solely to binding during infancy. And that's when analysts realized the physical evidence alone would never settle the debate. DNA, though fragile after 3 millennia, offered the possibility of a clearer answer. Samples taken from the remains produced genetic fragments so degraded that traditional sequencing methods struggled to read them. AI-supported reconstruction changed that. By identifying repeating patterns and linking partial strands, the algorithms rebuilt sections of mitochondrial DNA. The result was a genetic profile that did not fully match the haplogroups expected among early indigenous populations of the Americas. Instead, the sequences pointed toward regions across the ancient Near East and parts of Europe, which meant researchers were looking at something that did not follow the established path of migration from Northeast Asia across the Bering Land Bridge. The finding did not confirm long-distance travel or advanced seafaring, nor did it imply unknown civilizations. What it did reveal was that the ancient Andean coast may have been home to a more diverse population history than previously recognized. This challenged the simplicity of the old model, which assumed a single wave of early settlers. None of that mattered, however, unless the evidence could be placed into its historical context, and that required returning to the moment the remains were uncovered in the first place. The excavation that redefined a region. The story of the Paracas mystery truly began in 1927, when Julio Tello, a Peruvian archaeologist known for his careful fieldwork, traveled to the windswept cliffs of the Paracas Peninsula. The coastline there formed a stark meeting point between the Pacific Ocean and a desert so dry that organic material could remain intact for thousands of years. Local fishermen had spoken about unusual hollows beneath the ground, and Tello decided to investigate those rumors with a small team of assistants who were accustomed to working under harsh conditions. The result was a discovery that expanded the archaeological map of South America in ways no one expected. During the first days of excavation, the group cleared away layers of gravel and compacted sand until they uncovered the entrance to a series of deep, bottle-shaped chambers carved into the bedrock. Each chamber descended more than 20 feet, which meant they had been engineered with intention rather than dug hastily for temporary use. Once the team lowered themselves inside, they found burial bundles so well preserved that their original colors still appeared vivid. Bright reds and yellows stood out against the muted sand, creating an almost surreal contrast between the dry landscape above and the artistry hidden below. The textiles wrapped around the bodies were among the most detailed ever discovered in the region. They had been woven from alpaca wool and cotton, dyed with plant-based pigments that somehow resisted the bleaching effects of time. Many pieces displayed complex iconography, figures that appeared to represent spiritual intermediaries, astronomical symbols, and geometric patterns arranged with mathematical precision. One burial bundle after another revealed evidence of a culture with advanced artistic traditions and intricate ceremonial practices. And that's when Tello recognized he had uncovered the remains of a society distinct from any previously documented on the Peruvian coast. When the team began unwrapping the funerary bundles, the skeletal remains inside prompted immediate debate. The skulls exhibited the elongated shape that would later define the Paracas discoveries. Their smooth, extended crania contrasted sharply with the rounded skulls typical of neighboring groups. Although Tello was aware of global examples of head shaping, he noticed details that didn't align neatly with that practice. Those observations did not lead him to reject the head-binding explanation. Instead, they pushed him to document every feature meticulously, so future researchers could re-examine the remains with better tools. As more tombs were opened, patterns appeared. The individuals with the most elaborate wrappings and finely crafted textiles often possessed the most pronounced elongation, suggesting that the trait, whether cultural, biological, or both, held social significance. The arrangement hinted at a hierarchical society, one where certain lineages were distinguished not only through material wealth, but through physical appearance. And that raised new questions about how identity functioned within this culture, and whether the Paracas community understood skull shaping as a marker of status, ancestry, or spiritual symbolism. By the time Tello completed his survey of the area, he had uncovered dozens of burial structures, hundreds of textiles, and a collection of skulls that would become central to research for decades. The discovery established the Paracas culture as one of the most sophisticated ancient societies in the Andean region, renowned for its craftsmanship and funerary architecture. What nobody realized at the time was that these same skulls would later serve as key samples for genetic testing, becoming critical evidence in a discussion about population diversity in ancient South America, the anatomy that sparked a scientific debate. Once the Paracas skulls reached research collections after Julio Tello's excavation, their physical structure immediately stood out. Anthropologists recognized elongated skulls from other regions of the world, but the Paracas examples carried features that encouraged a much more detailed investigation. Their shape, volume, and internal composition pushed researchers to examine how much of their form came from cultural practice and how much reflected natural biological variation within this ancient population. Close measurement revealed that several skulls held cranial capacities close to 1/4 larger than the typical human average. That figure did not imply anything about cognitive ability, but it demonstrated that the interiors expanded in ways known deformation practices did not usually produce. Head binding alters exterior contours by applying pressure during infancy, yet it does not typically increase overall cavity volume. And that's when researchers began using more advanced imaging tools to understand the internal structure of the bone. Digital scans showed that some skulls carried increased thickness along specific regions, while others displayed unusual curvature near the back of the cranium. The most widely discussed detail involved the absence of the sagittal suture in a notable portion of the collection. In most humans, this suture remains visible throughout life as the divider between the parietal bones. Its absence in Paracas individuals prompted two competing interpretations: a congenital fusion present from birth or a naturally inherited trait within a particular lineage. Neither explanation held unanimous support, but both highlighted that these skulls could not be understood solely through external appearance. Another important feature involved the placement of the foramen magnum, the opening that connects the spine to the brain. In many Paracas skulls, this opening sat slightly farther toward the rear of the skull base. The shift did not indicate a separate species or dramatic functional difference, but it did place the Paracas remains outside the typical range found among other ancient Andean groups. This variation added another layer to the ongoing debate about how natural development and cultural influence interacted within this community. For much of the 20th century, the prevailing explanation centered on artificial cranial deformation, a documented practice in several ancient societies. Evidence from outside Peru included boards, wrappings, and bindings designed to alter head shape for aesthetic, symbolic, or social reasons. Many scholars believed the Paracas people practiced an elevated form of the same tradition. However, critics pointed out that deformation alone does not usually erase sutures, increase bone mass, or create internal structural changes. What nobody could determine with certainty was the degree to which binding interacted with inherited traits. Modern medical specialists later compared the Paracas skulls with contemporary cases of cranial synostosis, a condition where sutures closed prematurely. While some features overlapped, the Paracas examples lacked the asymmetry and irregular growth common in pathological cases. Their proportions appeared balanced, which suggested that at least some individuals may have developed elongated heads naturally, then inspired others to adopt shaping techniques for cultural or social reasons. By the time DNA studies became feasible, the anatomical debate had already transformed the Paracas skulls into a focal point of ancient Andean research. They represented an unusual combination of physical traits, burial traditions, and long-standing cultural practices. The next stage of analysis would shift attention away from the bones themselves and toward the genetic code preserved inside them, where researchers hoped to clarify the origins of this distinctive population. The DNA evidence that reframed the Paracas story. For decades, the Paracas skulls were studied almost entirely through physical examination. Researchers focused on bone structure, burial context, and the cultural environment that shaped this ancient community. But the question that lingered in every discussion, who were these individuals, could not be answered through anatomy alone. The next breakthrough arrived only when specialists attempted to recover genetic material from the remains, even though the 3,000-year-old environment had shattered most of the DNA into microscopic fragments. The first attempts at extraction produced scattered, incomplete strands. Traditional sequencing methods struggled with the damaged material, which meant researchers needed a new approach. That changed when laboratories began using AI-assisted reconstruction. By identifying recurring patterns in the degraded fragments, the algorithms connected partial sequences into a readable structure. The result was not a perfect genome, but it was strong enough to examine mitochondrial DNA. The portion passed directly through the maternal line. Once the reconstructed sequences appeared on screen, researchers expected them to align with haplogroups known among early indigenous populations of the Americas. According to the established migration model, the first settlers arrived from Northeast Asia after crossing the Bering Land Bridge, and their genetic signatures dominated ancient remains throughout the continent. Instead, the Paracas samples revealed markers that pointed toward regions thousands of miles away, including areas around the ancient Near East and sections of southern Europe. The findings surprised the laboratories involved, because it introduced a lineage not widely documented in early South American populations, and that's when the discussion shifted. The data did not imply transoceanic travel or advanced navigation. It did not suggest lost civilizations or unknown societies arriving on South American shores. What it indicated was a level of population diversity that had not been fully recognized in earlier models. Human migration is far more complex than single route diagrams, and the Paracas sequences suggested that multiple lineages, some distant, some unexpected, may have mixed over long spans of time before settling along Peru's southern coast. Another detail emerged from the analysis. Several samples displayed a high concentration of these non-local markers, while others showed blended signatures. This variation implied that the Paracas population was not genetically uniform. Instead, it may have formed through a combination of inherited traits, marriages between different groups, and patterns of movement that researchers are still working to understand. None of this erased the indigenous foundations of Andean civilization, but it did highlight the possibility that the region experienced waves of contact and genetic exchange long before written history. The revelation prompted the scientific community to revisit previous assumptions. Long-standing models often portrayed ancient South America as home to isolated populations that evolved in relative separation after their ancestral groups crossed from Asia. The Paracas data added evidence for a more dynamic scenario, one where migration, mixing, and regional interaction played larger roles than once believed. The result was a broader view of how early people moved across continents and how diverse populations emerged in unexpected places. Even with the insights provided by AI reconstruction, researchers emphasized caution. Ancient DNA analysis carries challenges. and each new result must be compared with larger datasets as they become available. Still, the Paracas findings opened a new window into population history on the Andean coast, offering details that physical anthropology alone could not supply. What nobody expected was how strongly these genetic results would influence discussions about cultural identity, ancestry, and the origins of the unusual skull shapes found in Tello's excavations. Interpreting the Paracas findings through a wider lens. When the Paracas DNA results entered academic circles, they immediately widened the conversation about early populations along the southern Peruvian coast. Archaeologists, geneticists, and anthropologists each approached the findings from different angles, but one point united them. The data added complexity to a region already known for cultural depth. Instead of confirming a single, isolated lineage, the results encouraged researchers to examine how multiple inherited backgrounds may have converged long before the Paracas culture emerged. Some specialists viewed the non-local maternal markers as evidence that ancient South America may have hosted a more varied population history than earlier models allowed. If distant lineages contributed to the ancestry of the Paracas community, the process likely unfolded slowly through generations of movement across continents. And that's when migration researchers re-examined older theories, proposing that people traveled through wide networks stretching across Eurasia and coastal Asia before reaching the Americas. These movements did not need to involve dramatic voyages. They could have been the product of gradual shifts, intermarriage, and interactions between neighboring groups over long stretches of time. From an archaeological perspective, the cultural artifacts found in Paracas burials supported the idea of a community shaped by both inherited traits and local development. The textiles, featuring more than 190 distinct color tones, reflected a sophisticated tradition of artistry unique to the Andean region. Their imagery often depicted elongated figures, ritual specialists, and symbolic motifs tied to the environment and spiritual beliefs. Scholars emphasized that these designs did not provide evidence for foreign ancestry. Instead, they displayed the Paracas people's own cosmology and ceremonial identity. Burial architecture added another layer of information. The deep, bottle-shaped tombs, discovered by Julio Tello, revealed an organized society that invested considerable labor into honoring its dead. Individuals with the most elaborate wrappings frequently appeared in chambers containing the finest textiles and the most pronounced cranial elongation. This pattern led some experts to propose that head shape functioned as a marker of status or lineage. If certain families possessed inherited cranial traits and later reinforced them through cultural shaping, then biology and social meaning may have blended into a single tradition. The discussion also intersected with broader ideas about how ancient knowledge moved between communities. Some scholars noted that early societies often developed similar symbols, agricultural practices, or architectural solutions without direct contact, since many environments demanded comparable responses. In this view, parallels between distant cultures resulted from shared human creativity rather than a single point of origin. And that perspective placed the Paracas achievements within a worldwide pattern of innovation, distinctive in style, yet connected through universal questions about survival, identity, and ritual. More speculative interpretations, which proposed a dispersed ancestral civilization spreading ideas across continents, resurfaced as well. Supporters of these theories pointed to myths and stories in various ancient regions describing culture bearers arriving from afar. Mainstream researchers acknowledged the value of understanding myth, but stressed that oral traditions evolved through storytelling, memory, and symbolic meaning. The Paracas skulls did not confirm a lost global civilization. Instead, they pushed scholars to explore how myth and archaeology can inform each other without merging into speculation. By the time these debates settled, one conclusion stood out clearly. The Paracas findings encouraged a broader, more nuanced view of early South American population history, one shaped by migration, local innovation, and cultural identity rather than a single linear narrative. The remains revealed a society deeply rooted in its Andean environment, yet connected to a wider human story that continues to unfold through new research, preservation, access, and the ongoing search for clarity. As the Paracas materials entered the modern research era, the focus broadened from what the remains revealed to how they were being protected. The skulls, textiles, and burial bundles uncovered by Julio Tello in 1927 became central to discussions about conservation and responsible scientific access. Institutions across Peru held most of the collection, which meant every request for analysis required approval from teams dedicated to safeguarding the fragile artifacts. DNA testing highlighted the challenge. Ancient bone and hair degrade rapidly when exposed to modern environments, and each extraction removes material that cannot be replaced. Because of this, institutions often limited new sampling unless a proposed method clearly reduced risk. And that's when a careful balance emerged. Researchers sought broader access for genetic work, while conservators prioritized the long-term survival of the remains. Both sides shared the same goal, understanding the Paracas people, yet approached it from different responsibilities. The restrictions sometimes led to speculation outside academic circles, but within professional communities, the reasoning remained straightforward. Preserving ancient material ensures that future scholars, equipped with better tools, can continue studying it. Geneticists acknowledged the concern, noting that even minor contamination could distort results. Museum administrators weighed these factors when reviewing requests, approving some, postponing others, and shaping the pace of research by protecting what survived from the desert tombs. Beyond DNA studies, new questions arose about how to examine the skulls and textiles without causing damage. Anthropologists encouraged using non-invasive scanning techniques, high-resolution CT imaging, surface mapping, and digital modeling to document internal and external features in greater detail. These approaches created opportunities to revisit earlier conclusions and compare Paracas remains with other Andean populations without physical contact. What nobody anticipated was how influential these digital records would become in refining discussions about cranial variation. The textiles required even more delicate care. Many were woven with fine alpaca wool and cotton, dyed in colors that remained vibrant for 3 millennia, but vulnerable to light, humidity, and handling. Conservators built controlled storage environments to keep them stable, which meant public display and direct study had to be limited. Yet these fabrics offered essential insight into ritual life, social identity, and the craftsmanship of the Paracas community. Their preservation reflected the same balance seen with the skeletal material: protect what remains while still learning from it. As research continued, the Paracas findings remained a subject of active collaboration rather than controversy. Scholars from genetics, archaeology, anthropology, and conservation met regularly to compare data and refine theories about population history on the southern coast of Peru. The skulls were no longer viewed solely as anatomical puzzles. They were recognized as part of a broader cultural system shaped by inherited traits, tradition, and environmental adaptation. Nearly a century after Tello's excavation, the Paracas materials still encourage open investigation. Each advancement, whether improved sequencing, better imaging, or refined conservation techniques, adds clarity to a story that has grown richer over time. The remains remind researchers that ancient societies were diverse, interconnected, and dynamic, and that responsible access is essential to understanding them fully. The Paracas discoveries endure because they continue to raise meaningful questions about identity, ancestry, and cultural expression. As long as the material is preserved and studied with care, it will remain an important chapter in the wider effort to understand humanity's past.